Music may be defined in numerous varying ways. When defining music, it is important that we note its role within a given culture, its context within the time period we are discussing, and of course, we have to realize that music is defined by highly subjective individual opinions. Some may even argue that music can be whatever anyone determines it to be. In the minds of the ancient Greeks, for example, music was all of the arts together. Drama, poetry, literature, dance, even visual arts to an extent, were music. Today, however, at least in the Western world, we think of music, we define music as the art of organized sounds. Module 1 discusses the basic concepts or the basic elements of music. These elements are rhythm, melody, harmony, timbre, and sound. Within Module 1, we will also be discussing how to attend different types of performances. We will also learn how to effectively understand and write about what we hear. As mentioned, music's definition varies depending on its role within given cultures throughout time, as well as subjective individual opinion. And we know that today we define music generally as the art of organized sounds. Regardless of any opinion, we generally can agree that sound has two primary elements: its highness or lowness, which is called the pitch of the sound, and its loudness or softness, in other words, its volume, which we define as dynamic level. Pitch is the relative highness or lowness of a sound. The pitch of a sound depends upon the rate of vibration, also known as its frequency, of whether it's voice or any type of instrument, viola, piano, cello, oboe, timpani even. The faster the frequency of a pitch is, the higher the pitch will be. When we discuss higher, we're not talking about it being loud, even though we can have a little bit of that perception due to high pitches being generally annoying. So when we think of a high-pitched instrument, we would think of something like a violin or a flute, a piccolo, or a very high female voice. We call that a soprano voice. I will not torment you with my singing, but we'll have some examples here soon. And the slower a frequency is, by contrast, is a lower pitch. So lower pitched instruments would include something like the double bass, the cello, of course a low, deep male voice. Even timpanis could be considered having a very low pitch. And timpani is a very large drum percussion instrument that is actually tuned and has pitch when it is struck. So when we continue on, we want to think of certain ranges of pitches within an instrument or a voice. And this range of pitches we call its register. So the piano is quite a unique instrument in that it has a lot of range. It has a very wide range. And within the piano, there are several different registers of, very low bass, basso profundo, very deep sounds, low-pitched sounds. Anything ranging into the middle areas where you could think of tenor, baritone, alto, and of course higher pitches of soprano, and even above what the human female voice can sing. An individual specific tone or note is called a pitch. In Western music, specific pitches are referred to with letter names that actually correspond to the first 7 letters of the English alphabet. So these would be A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. We can alter these 7 letters with accidentals. So when we have the plain basic letter, of course we can just call them by their name, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or we can add the qualifier natural. So A and A natural would be the same pitch. We can raise each of these letters by a half step, and that would produce a sharp note. So for example, A sharp. We can also lower that natural pitch by a half step, and that would produce a flat note. For example, A flat. Now, all of these natural letters can be sharped or flatted. And in fact, they can be double sharped and double flatted, but that gets into some experimental keys, which we won't go into here in this course. But it's important to know that each of these pitches can be raised or lowered. We also want to be aware that the distance between 2 pitches is known as an interval. So we can have large intervals or large distances between the notes. We can have medium, and of course we can have very close intervals. So for example, if I had a very close interval, let's take another letter here. Let's go with C. So if I had the note C and I went to C sharp, that is what in the Western conception of tonality would be considered the closest interval of a half step, because they are right next to each other. So we've just taken that natural C and raised it by the smallest interval we have of a half step to produce a C sharp. Now that could also go the other way, from C to C flat. That is also a half step apart, just in the opposite direction. We can have a large interval from a C in, say, the alto range, and a C higher, 8 notes apart, into the soprano range, which would produce what we call an octave. So this octave would produce, the same pitch, really, but in a different range, or a different register. Now, a medium interval would be something like a C to F. So that would produce what we would call a fourth. So we think C, D, E, F, that's 4 notes apart. So when we're listening to any music, we can hear these varying intervals. Depending upon the genre we're in, will have more extremes than others. Strangely enough, for a long time in Western music, composers did not actually indicate the level of volume for which they wanted their music to be performed. The volume of the music would depend on things like the number of performers, the types of singing voices or instruments, and the nature or the acoustical properties of the venue for the performance. Also, professional musicians would have been kind of schooled and learned in the ways of these kind of unwritten rules of following the shape of lines to determine the phrasing or the changes in volume that are not standard for the performers of today. It wasn't until the 17th century that composers actually began indicating dynamic levels within their own compositions. The composers used the terms of the great Italian musicians of the time, as the Italians were extremely revered and were imitated for many, many centuries throughout the rest of Europe, and even still today. So these Italian terms are now part of the general music vocabulary, and they are still widely accepted across the world. So the professional musicians and even the amateur musicians you yourself may be, or that are quite familiar with these Italian terms. Even today, we've branched out a little bit, and we can see different dynamic markings indicated in English, of course, as well as French and German and Spanish, even as this type of music has spread across the world. So what we want to focus on at this moment for our learning is the typical Italian terms that we see in. If you take a look at the chart on the slide, or if you're following along in your book, this would be sound, page 7 of chapter 1. We have the Italian term to the left, the abbreviation that you would see in the music or the symbol, and then to the far right of the chart, we have the English translation of the word. So starting from the softest, the most common softest dynamic term seen, we have two P's, which is pronounced pianissimo in Italian, and it means very soft. One P corresponds to piano, which is soft or quiet. You can think of soft as quiet. Then we have MP, mezzo piano, which is moderately soft. MF, mezzo forte, which is moderately loud. Forte is one F, loud, and two Fs is fortissimo, which is very loud. So we want to memorize these general terms so that we can use them in our upcoming discussions and papers. We can also have not just a solid indication of tempo, but a changing of tempo indication, which is usually shown by these kind of greater than, less than symbols that you might kind of recognize from music, and they can be, quite short or long depending on the composer's intention. So when we have from small to big, we have what we call crescendo, which means gradually becoming louder. The opposite way from big to small is decrescendo, which means becoming softer. And we can also call that diminuendo, which is becoming softer. Diminuendo somewhat has a bit of a connotation of also slowing down, but not always. So you want to also be aware that just because something is loud does not equate to being fast, and just because something is quiet does not necessarily mean it is going to be slow. Keep that in mind for future reference. The way that we change dynamics in performance can be done in many ways, but the most common ways are simply by having the instruments or voices play louder or softer. And we can also add instruments, the number of instruments or voices, or we can take away as well. But generally, it will be the actual individual performers altering how loud or soft they are playing, rather than, cutting people out or adding people back in. The reason that we have increased dynamic properties as time goes on is, of course, music is becoming more complex, and society is becoming more complex, more open and more free, and more expressive. Our first listening example is Also sprach Zarathustra, which translates from the German as Thus Spake Zarathustra. This work was composed by the great German romantic Richard Strauss. Strauss wrote this work in 1896, which was right in the middle of his prime. The concepts we are going to focus on here are pitch and dynamics. This work is also something we will discuss in our later modules. It is a tone poem based on the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's novel, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Each of the chapters and the corresponding themes within the tone poem kind of trace the major events of the main character Zarathustra's philosophical journey throughout his life. In this example, Strauss uses great changes in pitch and dynamics to heighten the sense of drama and suspense. In this work, you will hear an orchestra, trumpets, orchestral drums, especially the timpani, and of course, rising levels of pitch and dynamics. The introduction consists of a single low pitch in the double basses, the contrabassoon, and the organ. it starts incredibly softly at a dynamic level akin to pianissimo or double P. The introduction of the theme, which is the main melody, represents nature or the sunrise. This theme is first played by the trumpets, also very softly at pianissimo, and at a relatively low pitch for the trumpet, which actually has quite an extensive range and can go quite high in its register. The orchestra and the orchestral drums complete this melody as it grows louder, crescendoing. The second statement of the theme actually begins a bit louder at mezzo forte, and it continues to grow to a higher pitch level than the initial statement of the theme. The third statement of the theme is at its loudest so far at forte. The music continues to crescendo further as instruments are added and moving towards the ultimate climactic pitch. The continuation of the melody features the entire orchestra playing it at the top of their dynamic range of double F or fortissimo. We highlight this as well with major cymbal crashes that accentuate the point of climactic arrival. Bolero by the French composer Maurice Ravel is another fine example of the concepts of pitch and dynamics. Bolero, like Alsace Sprach, begins at a quiet dynamic level and crescendos to an exciting climax as more and more instruments join in on the motivic theme and increase their own individual dynamic levels. Bolero was written in 1928, and we can see that there will definitely be a little bit more of a Spanish flair. The prelude to Richard Wagner's opera Lohengrin is another example of contrasting pitch and dynamics. The opera is a medieval tale of chivalry and betrayal. It contrasts spiritual purity against worldly evil. The title character, Lohengrin, is indeed one of the Knights of the Grail. The prelude is the first of the 3 acts, and it musically depicts a vision of the Holy Grail descending to earth. The prelude opens with shimmering strings at a high pitch and quiet volume. As the Grail descends from heaven, the pitch of the orchestra becomes lower, and the dynamic crescendos louder. At the prelude's climax, which is dramatically accentuated with brass and percussion, the Grail slowly returns to the heavens, receding into the high register of the orchestra with soft dynamics. Here we have 3 greatly contrasting genres of modern music. The first example is It's Oh So Quiet by Björk from 1995. In it, you will hear a great explosive range of dynamics. That same explosive energy is heard in 2019's 'Cause I Love You by Lizzo. We also have Chop Suey from System of a Down, which I guess could be described as a combination of rock, alternative, screamo, and metal. Enjoy. We will be discussing these 3 pieces in our discussion section this week.